Hi, I'm Gretchen Hirsch, and I'm a sewing author and blogger. And one of the things I love most is working with vintage patterns and retro patterns. So today I want to talk about some techniques that you can use on sheer fabrics. And I started working with these techniques when I was making these little 50s inspired blouses. You can see the little purple one behind me that I did in poly chiffon. Which is a tricky fabric to work with because everything is exposed and you don't want your frayed seams hanging out. So what I started working with was French seams, of course, but then I found a better solution for a curved seam, which is a hairline seam. So I'm really excited to show you that. But first, let's talk about the kind of thread and needle you want to use on shears. So you're going to be looking for a fine thread, and that is as opposed to an all-purpose. They're both polyester threads. They're both very strong, but this one is just a little bit finer, as you can see maybe you can see if I lay these two threads out here. It's just slightly finer and it's much more compatible with the sheer fabric. Now, and also just, the example of doing top stitching with a heavy thread, you would use a bigger needle. So for the fine thread, you want to go in the opposite direction and use a smaller needle. When I was sewing that chiffon blouse, I think I used a size 10 sewing machine needle. So when you pair those two things together, you're going to automatically reduce some of the headaches that come with sewing slippery sheer fabrics like chiffons, because the sewing is just much easier. So that's why I turned to this hairline seam, which I read about in a sewing book a few years ago, and it's really pretty genius. Because what it is it's sort of like a baby hem. If you've ever done a triple stitched baby hem on a lightweight fabric, it's the same thing, but you're doing two layers of fabric together. And so what you get, I have a little sample here, is this really, really fine finish on the inside where everything is enclosed. And then on the outside, you just have a beautiful seam, and you can't see all the inner workings that you would if you just did a French seam or a regular pressed open seam. So this is a really nice solution, and I just love, this is a silk georgette, and I think it's just really beautiful, and it's perfect for this kind of blouse. So it's really floaty, and you're definitely going to want to try one of these finishes, especially if you have a curve. And the blouse I'm sewing right now does have a curve at the hip. But first I'm going to show you this technique on the shoulder, which is a pretty straight seam. So you can just sort of see the technique, and then we'll move on to the curve seam. So I've started making a new blouse in this lovely floral georgette, and I've pinned my shoulder seam together. So this is a very straight seam. So we're just going to practice this technique on an easy straight seam, and then we'll get to the curve technique. So first thing I'm going to do is sew at 3/8 of an inch. And this is very similar to doing a French curve or a narrow hem. You basically just want to leave a 1/4 inch after this pass to play with. So if you're using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you would use a 1/4 inch now. So you still had a 1/4 inch left over for the next two steps. But because I have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I am going to use 3/8 of an inch for my first seam allowance. All right, so I'm just on a regular straight stitch here. I'm just gonna, and I'm sewing, really important to note that I have my right sides together, just like any other seam. With a French seam, you're gonna be sewing with your wrong sides together, which always feels very weird and foreign. But this is just like a regular seam, right sides together. Okay, so I'm gonna go all the way to the end here. Backstitching isn't quite as important on this process because we have 3 lines of stitching on this seam, so it's pretty secure. So there we have just one simple line of stitching. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the stitching in. I'm going to turn that seam allowance in so that I can just see my last line of stitching. And now I'm going to stitch just to the left of it. So I want to position my needle so it's just to the left there. Okay, so I'm just stitching to the left of that line. Oops. And I got a little stuck there, as sometimes happens at the beginning of a seam on a lightweight fabric, but now we're doing fine. What can happen is that the fabric can get sucked down into the needle hole, so Just hold your fabric a little taut to avoid that. Okay, so just take this slow. As you can imagine, it takes a little bit of concentration to get right next to that first line of stitching. And again, really no need to backstitch here. Okay, so now I have 2 lines of stitching right next to each other and the exposed seam allowance right here. I'm going to cut that down now. And you'll want to use a very small, sharp pair of scissors here. And these ones are really nice because they have a curve and they let me get very close to that line of stitching. Now, this is a step you definitely don't want to rush because if you get sloppy here, you can cut through your entire blouse. And then you have to start over with the cutting and everything. So be very careful. I'm just cutting next to that line of stitching. And yeah, the curved scissors really help here because they help me isolate just the seam allowance. Okay, so now I have that trimmed down seam allowance. Let me just get rid of some more threads here. You build up a lot of threads on this seam finish. Okay, so now my last step is to turn the entire thing in one more time and again stitch right next to my last line of stitching, just to the left. So I'm just gonna turn that in like that, get it where I want under the presser foot. And you'll notice I'm not using the iron at all to press during this process. I would use it for the next step after I finish the entire seam and press it all to one side, but it's not necessary to press mid-process. Okay, so I'm just turning that little seam allowance in and stitching right to the left of my last line of stitching, which is a really, really tiny little area. I guess that's why they call this a hairline seam. And it's kind of hard to see on a floral, so maybe try this for the first time on a solid. Okay, and just take it slow, just turn in like that. Okay. All right, so that would be my finished hairline seam, and my next step would be to just press the whole seam to one side. So isn't that lovely? It's really nice, so once it's pressed, it'll look very smooth on the outside. So let's talk about how you would do this on a curved seam. I've already stitched the first step on the side seam, which has a hip curve here. When I go around that curve, I'll sort of give you a demo here where I start just at the curve. It's going to start resisting that turn in on the second step. So what I'm going to need to do is start clipping, just like you would anytime you sew a seam or a curved seam. So, and I actually find it helpful to just clip as I'm sewing. So when I stop and I see that I'm getting some resistance there, I'm just going to clip very carefully again into that seam allowance. And then it's going to let me turn it in really nicely. So let's just sew a little bit more of this seam here so you can see it go around this curve. So there are my clips, and it's just curling nicely in, as you can see now. So another thing I want to mention is that a really nice technique that you can use on shears is to change out your needle plate, which is this metal bit underneath the presser foot. You can change it from a regular needle plate to a single hole needle plate, which only allows you to do a straight stitch. But it only has that one hole, so there's less of a chance of things getting sucked down into the feed dogs. And you have to pair it with a, well, you don't have to, but it's a good idea to pair it with a straight stitch foot, which only allows you to do this straight stitch. And another good tip is I like to put a Post-it note over my stitch selector, like a bright yellow Post-it note that reminds me not to change any of my stitches to a zigzag or anything like that, because if you do use a zigzag on a single hole needle plate, you will break a needle very dramatically. So that's another good technique to use if you're having trouble with that chiffon or georgette being pulled down into the feed dogs. So that is your technique for sewing a hairline seam on shears.